Welcome to this episode of the Menzies Research Centre's Water Cooler podcast. Today we are so privileged to be joined by the wonderful Jane Hume, our Shadow Finance Minister. Jane, welcome.
It's terrific to be here, Freya. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for joining us. I want to start with getting to know you a bit about your background, because it's not very conventional for a lot of senators. Could you tell us what you did before entering Parliament?
Yeah, sure. So I was a banker. I worked in banking and finance, and particularly in superannuation. Just before I came into Parliament, I was working at Australian Super, which is the biggest superannuation fund, industry superannuation fund out there at the time. I think it is now officially the biggest in the country. But I was always a Liberal Party volunteer. I didn't join till I was about 30, but I handed out how to vote cards as a kid. My family were a very sort of small business family. And so I was always interested in politics. And I think that, the interest turned into a passion, which turned into an obsession, which eventually turned into a profession. But it always sort of ran alongside my private sector career. So it was a lovely transition. And I did, I do agree with that, the adage that if you do something that you love, you'll never work a day in your life.
So true. And was there a moment when you decided to run?
I actually, believe it or not, I put my hand up for a state seat in about 2006, and I just finished doing a politics degree. I went back and did a politics degree when I was pregnant with my second child, and third, funnily enough.
Wow.
And so I was sort of working. I was studying part-time while I was looking after the kids. And I just finished that degree when my local state seat came available. And I thought, that would be an interesting thing to do. So I put my hand up just for interest's sake, to raise my head above the parapet for the first time. And my goodness, didn't realise exactly what a pre-selection got involved. It was such a, I won't use a phrase, but it was.
I think we know what you're thinking.
It was much more involved than I thought it was going to be. I came in a very respectable second, but it was a little bit like being run over by a truck and then sitting up at the end going, wow, I loved that, I'll do that again. And look, good people took me aside after that moment and said, we think you've got talent and we want to help you with the next step of your career.
Amazing.
So look, I kept with it, I kept volunteering, I kept getting more involved in campaigns, more involved with the organisational wing of the party, and then eventually a Senate spot was available. I put my hand up for that one. Was pre-selected for it. Look, in the end, and that makes it sound very simple, it wasn't, but at the end of the day, I was the very last senator elected. I was on that sort of colour and movement end of the ticket, but I was number 76 of 76 senators.
So good. And you said you had 3 kids in that time. How did you, there are probably a lot of women watching this podcast that are thinking, how do you juggle, raising 3 kids with an intense career and then entering politics? How did you handle it all?
Yeah, look, I would love to say, you just need to be very organised and have a great support system and then it all just works itself out. And I've got to admit, at the time, that's exactly what I was saying. And I did have those things. I was very lucky. But there is no doubt about it that it was certainly, the smooth duck on the top of the water and the feet were paddling underneath. It was really hard. It was really hard. There were moments where I got a call from the school, for instance, during the first time I was chairing a Senate Estimates Committee, to say that my middle son had set off the fire extinguisher in the school hall and was about to be suspended, and could I come and get him? And I'm like, well, no. I'm in Canberra and I'm not available for the next 14 hours to discuss it. So there's always those moments. And look, every mother will have those moments in every job. Politics isn't exceptional.
That's so interesting. So I guess when you were first thinking about getting into politics, what was it that attracted you to the Liberal Party in particular?
Look, I think it genuinely is part of the DNA. My parents were both members. They joined during the Whitlam era.
Wow.
And we were a sort of small business family. It was just understood that that's what we did. We went and handed out how to vote cards for the Liberal Party. And so it was sort of embedded in me. But then, as I said, I went back to university when I was an adult because I knew what I believed, but I probably couldn't articulate or contextualise why I believed in it. And that really helped me. It gave me sort of an historical context as well as a sort of philosophical one. And it, convinced me all the more that there was no alternative. You know, free markets create free citizens and create prosperity for all. That's what I wanted to do.
So good. And I think those are the liberal values that so many Australians really resonate with. As you look at this upcoming election, it's probably going to be called in the next couple of weeks, and Australians will be going to the polls before May 18. What do you see as the key issues that will define this election?
So there's probably two. And they are the two greatest responsibilities of government. One is national security, keeping your citizens safe. But the other is the economy, making sure that you raise the standard of living. And this is a government that's failed on both fronts. We don't feel safer than we used to, and we certainly don't feel better off. Now, I'm going to leave the national security stuff to others because my bailiwick is really on the economic side. And the fact that we've seen a decline in the standard of living in Australia of 8.7% over the last 3 years is unprecedented. We haven't seen a decline that deep, that fast, ever before. Before. So it's not all in people's heads. They're not just feeling poorer, they actually are poorer. That is an indictment on this government. So that's really, I think, the issue that is going to play out most at the ballot box. People are frustrated that they have seen themselves go backwards rather than forwards. That, and it's not just sort of the broader population. It's also intergenerational. Younger people in particular, I think now, have a very different attitude. Previous generations have always said, if I do the right things, if I get an education, if I save my money, get a job, get a trade, if I'm not profligate, well then I have a chance to get ahead. I have a chance to do as well, if not better, than my parents did. This current generation of young people don't feel that way. They don't feel that they will ever do as well as the generation before. Now that is a real problem, and it's on us to fix it.
That's so true. I mean, just speaking to my friends, I'm 22, and I think there's a real sense that our generation will be the first in Australian history to have a worse quality of life and a worse standard of living than our parents. And I just think, how can people look at that and think that that's okay?
It's not okay.
How are we now at a point where we've all just kind of accepted that from here on forward, it's decline for Australia? I don't think that's the narrative we should accept. I don't think it's the reality we should accept. So I think one of the key issues related to that is home ownership and housing affordability. And I've just bought my first apartment as a first home buyer. Thank you. But it was super tough. And I think for a lot of people, it's just not even a possibility anymore. So how has this housing crisis arisen? What is the issues driving this?
Well, there's a few things. I mean, the obvious one is supply. You know, economics doesn't change. It's still a function of demand and supply. We now have more people in the country who want to buy fewer and fewer houses. So the housing stock hasn't increased at the same rate as the population. That's not helped by having 1 million new migrants in the space of 2 years. In fact, that has exacerbated a problem that already existed. The other, of course, one of the great drivers of supply is cost. And the cost of building in Australia is exorbitant. I did hear that because of the influence of the CFMEU, the most militant construction union, that building costs in Australia are about 30% higher than they are around the rest of the world. They're around 50% higher in my home state of Victoria, which is like ground zero for the CFMEU. Now, it's not that the CFMEU are building homes, but of course, if you've got CFMEU construction workers demanding higher and higher wages and conditions, well then of course that feeds into the private sector builders as well, so residential builders. So you can see where the problem lies. The other is red tape and regulation. Councils and state governments are imposing stricter and stricter environmental laws, safety, workplace health and safety laws, all these sorts of things that are pushing up costs. There were other problems as well, don't get me wrong. We did have supply chain issues during COVID and that played out, but they've come back down again now. That's not the issue. But there's one more issue that people don't talk about enough. And that is how hard it is for young people to save for a deposit. Now, when I bought my first home back in the olden days when there were carts and horses and carts, wasn't that bad. I was about 24. Back at that stage, superannuation was about 4% of your salary. Well, in the middle of this year, it will be 12% of your salary. So we're now asking people to save a greater proportion of their take-home pay and to put it away, quarantine it for potentially up to 40 years for their retirement, rather than put it into the savings for a deposit on a home. That's unfair and unreasonable and wrong, because it's also inefficient, because the biggest indicator of economic security in retirement is home ownership. Even if you have no superannuation, it is possible to live on an age pension. It won't be a glamorous retirement, but it's possible to live on an age pension, but not if that age pension also requires you to pay rent, which is why it's so important that we get more and more people into home ownership, because that's how you create a prosperous nation and a higher standard of living for more Australians. It's why it is so fundamentally important for the Liberal Party. Home ownership is part of our, essential to essentially our philosophy.
Yeah, I just want to drill in on that point a little bit, because I've seen all over TikTok, Abby Chatfield did this podcast with Albo, and she basically railed against the Coalition's policy on super for housing, saying that this is going to, one, push up house prices, and two, how you should never take money out of your super to buy a home, because you're ruining your nest egg for retirement.
Well, it's nonsense.
But it is, right? Yeah. So I guess on the first point on will it push up housing prices, maybe around the edges, but how many first home buyers are there actually, versus it just seems to be there would really not be that big of an impact.
No, exactly.
On prices.
Not all home buyers are first home buyers. So those that are first home buyers do need that leg up. Yeah. Well, that's one of the reasons why. And if you want to sort of advantage all home buyers more broadly, and give them a better chance of success at an auction or when they're bidding on a home, well, that's why we have the policy of making sure that foreign owners can't buy houses for at least the first 2 years of a Dutton coalition government. And so that's a nonsense. It's not really going to. It is very much at the margins. Yeah. But I think that the other issue that you raise here is really important. It's very misunderstood, and it's intentionally misunderstood by the Labor Party. When you take that money out of your superannuation, you use it for a deposit on a home, but when you sell that home, and most people do sell their first homes at some stage, you put that money back into superannuation plus a pro rata of the earnings that you have made, the profit you have made on that home. Now, if you look at a balanced fund in a superannuation versus the returns you would have made in residential property over the last 20 years, you probably would have made more in a house than you would have putting your money into superannuation. So you're not robbing your retirement. Yeah. You actually might be doing it a favour. But Labor don't want to talk about that because they know that the more and more money that they put into superannuation, the more fees that are earned by the superannuation funds, and that's really that's their objective. Yeah. They're not there for the individual homeowner, they're there for the superannuation funds. Labor seem to forget that superannuation is not their money, it's not unions' money, it's not the fund manager's money. It's individuals' savings. It's their hard-earned, and they should be able to do with it what is best for them. Now, I don't disagree with the concept of superannuation. I know some people do. They don't like the idea of compulsory quarantining money. It does solve one sort of economic bias, if you like, a myopia that all people have. They cannot imagine what it is that they're going to want or need in 20 years' time, 30 years' time, 40 years' time. So it does help with that. But that doesn't mean that it should not be considered as part of your savings. And you should be able to do with it what you want in order to give yourself a better retirement outcome. The best retirement outcome comes from owning a home. So true. I love that so much. So I guess the next issue that's really important to young people in particular is the environment. Now, this often comes up, the debate around the environment. Labor has said they will not consider nuclear, and we will continue to have a ban on nuclear power in Australia. Is it just me, or is it a bit silly that the party saying, oh, we need to take more action on climate, and bragging about all the action they're taking, is saying no to one of the cleanest, most reliable forms of energy? It's nuts, isn't it? I mean, it is simply an ideological opposition that makes no sense whatsoever. Why you wouldn't even just lift the moratorium?
Exactly.
Take the ban off the table, because there is no logical reason for it. If the top 20 developed countries in the world either have nuclear power or are looking at having nuclear power now, why would we not consider it, particularly when we have the largest reserves of uranium around the world? So we're digging this stuff up and sending it overseas for other people's cheap energy, cheap, clean energy.
Yeah.
Why would we not use it ourselves?
Exactly. And I think Chris Bowen and Albo's plan to get to net zero with purely wind and solar, it just seems like a fantasy, or maybe green hydrogen, as if that is somehow more realistic than nuclear. So what do you think is driving this? Do they think that they're going to be retired by the time this actually becomes an issue for Australians, so they can just kick the can down the road and not really deal with it and just win political points now? Or why are they pursuing this approach?
That's a very good question, and I think you're probably asking the wrong person, because I scratch my head over it too. I cannot understand why they would be so belligerent on something that is actually not unusual for the rest of the world. If you go to France, or you go to the UK, or the US, I mean, there are nuclear power stations.
Even South Africa has a nuclear power station.
They're there, they're operating, and they happen, you can be drinking a glass of wine and eating a piece of cheese at a farm, and you can see the nuclear power station in the background in France. It hasn't stopped people drinking wine or eating cheese.
Yeah.
There's certainly no three-eyed fish, let's put it that way.
Yeah.
It is crazy.
It seems so ridiculous. I think linked to power prices, obviously high energy prices filter through the entire supply chain and push up the price of everything, and everything's up around, I think, 11% since the last election. So cost of living is going to be a huge, huge issue. What would you like to see a Liberal national government do around cost of living?
Yeah, so there's a few things here. The cost of living crisis is being driven by a number of factors, but so many of them manifest in inflation.
Yeah.
Inflation in this country has been too high for too long, and the government hasn't done enough to bring it down quicker. Now, the government will point to the Reserve Bank and say, well, that's their job. But the problem is the Reserve Bank is in charge of monetary policy. The government is responsible for fiscal policy. And unless you've got your monetary policy and your fiscal policy working together, they actually work against each other. So there's poor old Michelle Bullock with her foot on the monetary policy brake, trying to slow the economy down. But there's Albanese
through raising interest rates.
Through raising interest rates, which really hurt, particularly a particular segment of the market. But there's Jim Chalmers and Anthony Albanese with their foot on the accelerator, spending more and more money throughout their budgetary processes, using their fiscal policy, and that is keeping interest rates higher for longer. So while other countries would manage to get their inflation down earlier, bring their interest rates down earlier, we were much slower off the mark. That's meant that CPI, I should say, inflation, has cumulatively risen by around 11% over the last 3 years. But that's not what prices have done. You've got to recall that CPI measures a particular basket of goods, but it doesn't include things like the cost of housing. So prices overall have gone up about 19% over the last 3 years. And you can feel that when you go to a supermarket. You know that food's gone up around 12%. Education's gone up around, I think it's 10%. But electricity, for instance, has gone up more than 30%.
Yeah.
Gas has gone up more than 30%. Rent is like 17%.
Yeah.
Insurance is like 19%.
Crazy.
So all of these other pressures that aren't necessarily well represented in the basket of goods have gone up much more. And that's why people are really feeling the pain.
Exactly. And I think one of the lines, especially at the 2022 election, Labor really tried to create this idea that wages weren't moving, and a Labor government would get wages moving, they'd get wages up. But what we've seen is inflation up, and wages, they've kind of gone up, but really only because the Fair Work Commission has increased minimum wage. So it's sort of artificially pushed up a lot of wages at the bottom end. But if it's corresponding with a huge rise in inflation, your real wages are actually declining.
Straight down. That's exactly right.
And so I feel like they're just telling a bit of a lie to the Australian people.
Well, you note that they will always say your wages are up, but they don't say your real wages are up. Real wages have only just started getting into positive territory in the last few months. And that's because inflation has been so high. So even though, and that's why people feel poorer. You know, they go, I've had a wage rise.
Where's it gone?
Where's my money gone? Where has my money
Exactly.
gone? And it's because inflation has eaten it all up.
Yeah.
So getting inflation down, keeping it between that 2 to 3% band is fundamentally important. And it drives up so many other things. You know, the reason why under a coalition government in the last 9 years before this Labor government, nobody spoke about HECS going through the roof was because it was indexed.
Yeah.
Of course, you know, I mean, it's an interest-free loan. But the indexation, you didn't notice if inflation was low. Beer excise, you didn't notice it because inflation was low. Fuel excise, if inflation's low, you don't notice these things. They don't affect you on a day-to-day basis. But of course, if inflation's high, it pushes up the price of everything else.
This is what gets me so much. When Labor then turns around and goes, guys, we're going to pause the draft beer excise. We're going to change HECS indexation. It's like, this is only a problem because you can't control your spending. Inflation is a government-created issue. And they want to turn around and say, we're doing a favour to the Australian people by pausing indexation. It's like, no, you don't get to claim that win when you created this issue.
They're solving problems of their own
that
making.
they created, right?
Yeah, absolutely right.
It's so ridiculous. I want to get into that a little more around the HECS stuff. I think for a lot of young people, it is a burden you feel having this HECS debt. And for a lot of us, they're huge. A 3-year bachelor's degree will cost you $40,000, $50,000. And for a declining benefit, to be honest, in the job market. So what do you make of Labor's policy to slash HECS by 20%?
There's a couple of aspects to it. I mean, one is it's a clear vote buy for a cohort that it believed it's lost, not to the Liberal Party, I might actually add, to the Greens. So they were trying to buy those votes back. And, you know, I have kids that are at university now and they go, oh, that's, you know, not a bad thing. So I can see where they've gone with it. But there's a couple of aspects to it. One is that sense of user pays, which is really important. People that have a university degree earn more than those that don't. And if you discount HECS the way that the government has said that it will, you're essentially getting those that aren't getting the benefit from those university degrees to pay for those that will get the benefit. Yes, it might not feel it in the short term when you're paying off a HECS debt, but in the longer term, you will earn much more over your lifetime if you have a university degree.
Yeah.
And the government already subsidises the vast majority of the cost of a degree. HECS is just a contribution towards your own education. So that's one aspect to it. But the other is it just kind of kicks the can down the road, isn't it? It delays the inevitable HECS debt that people are going to have. And, you know, it makes the medium-term budget worse. So, so it's still going to be a cost to all taxpayers in the future, young and old.
Exactly. And I also think, I mean, we've written a fair bit about higher education here at Menzies. I've done a paper on how we could reform HECS, and Nico, our economist, has done a lot of research on international students. And I think another issue that I have with this policy is that it almost lets universities off the hook. It's like the government is effectively going to bail universities out for 20% of the cost of the degree. I'm mad at universities for providing a lot of young Australians with degrees that aren't actually giving them the skills that they are promised.
Yeah.
And I think that's only going to continue. We've seen some of the targets that Labor has for the percentage of people they want attaining a university degree. But over time, the degree inflation just devalues them overall. And our universities have become like multi-billion-dollar corporations that really don't care about the individual students or degrees that they're producing.
I do think, you're right. There is a much broader discussion to have here. It does seem like almost everything these days requires a university degree. That's crazy.
Yeah.
You know, there are trades and professions out there that don't necessarily need a university degree from, you know, one of the inner city universities either. You know, we've probably got to rethink, you know, almost, I don't want to say start from scratch or, you know, sort of an overarching reform. This is not my portfolio, so I don't want to sort of, you know, put the future Minister for Education in an awkward spot. But we're missing something.
Yeah.
The university experience has been so fundamentally diminished. It's nothing like the way it used to be. The value of the degrees that are coming out the other end has also diminished. And yet somehow we seem to be creating some universities that make an awful lot of money and huge debts for those students at the other end as well. It's just
exactly.
It's not working on so many levels.
And I feel there's one really, I think I heard it was Sarah Henderson, the Shadow Education Minister, gave this statistic on your user pays point and why it's so important that if you get the value of something, you actually should be the one paying for it. Because there was like a free TAFE trial, or they've already implemented free TAFE, and the completion rate was something like
low.
14%. And so you've got thousands of people going to TAFE on the taxpayer dollar, and then 14% of them are completing the degree.
That's right.
But it's so true. Like if I get something for free, I'm just not going to value it as much if I had to pay for it. So I just think that's a great point. I think the next thing that would be interesting to discuss is I heard Governor Philip Lowe say that one of the biggest causes of the cost of living crisis is also declining productivity growth. Now, this seems to have been a kind of a structural issue in the Australian economy for the last 20 years. We've basically had no productivity growth. Why has that happened? How has this happened? And is there any way we can reverse this?
Yeah, so Philip Lowe is obviously now the former governor of the Reserve
former
Bank.
governor, sorry.
And he bailed the cat some time ago. He said to a Senate committee, I think it was, that you simply cannot have continual wage rises without corresponding productivity growth. Otherwise, those wage rises are inflationary. And that's a very, very good point. We have had declining productivity over the last few years, and it is an intractable problem right around the world. We keep expecting these great sort of productivity leaps to come out of technological advances, and they haven't come. Smartphones are a great example. You go, oh, look at, we've got the internet in our pocket these days. Surely that's a productivity gain. Well, is it? I don't know. But it doesn't seem to have played out in the data. There are ways, though, that you can inject productivity into the economy again. The best way is reducing regulation and red tape. When you overburden the private sector with red tape, it simply costs them more, it slows them down, and it stops them doing what they do best, which is innovate, achieve, employ and grow. So that's number one, which is why we have a deregulation and a red tape reduction agenda going into the next election. And it doesn't matter whether we're talking about environmental approvals, whether we're talking about financial advice, all of these things are becoming sort of so overburdened with red tape and regulation that it is slowing the economy down. The other, of course, though, is industrial relations. Now, when your industrial relations system is inflexible, it costs the economy more. And while Labor will say, well, it's great for workers, in fact, it's going to be worse for workers because there'll be fewer jobs and they'll be less likely to take on new employees that are, can do interesting things, fewer interesting jobs, if you like, too. So, and of course, with industrial relations, it disproportionately affects small businesses over large businesses. Small businesses don't have a compliance department, they don't have in-house legal counsel, they don't have potentially a human resources department.
Admin.
That's right.
Yeah.
So deregulation and red tape and industrial relations are inexorably intertwined, but they are both fundamentally important as productivity drivers. The other one, though, of course, is energy prices. And we've already discussed energy prices, how electricity and gas bills in particular have gone through the roof. If you bring down the price of energy, you reduce costs for business and they can create more. Now, I'm from Victoria, and Victoria is a state that has had, I should say, a thriving manufacturing sector.
Yeah.
But it did that. You can only have a thriving manufacturing sector if you've got one of two things, cheap energy or cheap labour. Now, we've chosen not to have cheap labour in this country. That's just fundamental to our values. That's okay. But if you can't have cheap labour, you've got to have cheap energy, because otherwise you simply cannot have a thriving manufacturing or a competitive manufacturing sector. So bringing down energy prices is really important. And then the final piece of the productivity puzzle really comes from having lower and simpler and fairer taxes.
Yes.
Because otherwise you suck the aspiration out of an economy. It means that employers, or employees I should say, won't take on the extra days, they won't take on the extra hours to create that productivity gain. So that's how you build productivity. And it's so important because economic growth relies on one of three things. It relies, or a combination of three things: population, productivity, and participation.
Yeah.
And participation's already pretty high in this country. Population has gone very, very
Can't get
high.
much
We
higher.
don't want it to get much higher. It's actually beginning to be a drag on our standard of living as opposed to enhancing. So it must come through productivity.
It's got to be that pace.
And that's why you'll hear Angus Taylor and I talking about this constantly. How do we improve productivity?
That's so good. Just as we wrap up now, there's one more issue I really want to get your thoughts on, and it's blowing up in the global media, but that is government waste. It has really taken the US by storm, but we at the Menzies Research Centre have started looking into grants that the Labor government has given out in the last 2.5 years, and it's just as bad. And then I think you revealed a $20,000 bespoke desk that the public service revealed. What's going on? Why is Australia, how have we fallen into the same trap with government waste?
It literally is a lack of discipline. It's a sense that when you spend somebody else's money, it doesn't matter so much. The outcome doesn't matter so much. And it's about changing that cultural mindset that every dollar government spends is a dollar that somebody else has earned.
Yes.
And unless you maintain that discipline with everything you do, well, then you get extraordinary profligacy and waste. And that $20,000 desk, which was part of a $56,000 renovation for one public servant, for one office, is a very good example. And ironically, that desk is now in storage somewhere.
I'll take the desk.
Well, I don't know where it is.
Surely.
We think we should have a competition. If you find the desk, you get to keep the $20,000 desk.
Oh my goodness. Well, thank you so much, Jane. It has been such a privilege and a pleasure getting to speak to you, and thanks for giving up so much of your time. Just as we wrap up, what is your final message to Australians ahead of this next election?
Okay, I think the message for Australians at the next election is that there is an alternative, a genuine alternative, an alternative that has an idea, that has a series of ideas, a series of policies that will create the prosperity of the future, that will raise your standard of living. At the same time, we know that our first responsibility is to keep our citizens safe, and that's why you'll hear us talk so much about whether it be border security, whether it be national security, whether it be social cohesion. This is what we expect of our society, but at the same time, we want everybody to have a prosperous future.
So good. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Freya.